session is called What Makes Your MP Tick? And the aim of the session is to start to think really strategically about what influences MPs in general, and more specifically, what influences the MP in your constituency, who your constituency group is focusing on. And the reason that we're focusing on this is because we are MP Watch. MPs are obviously central to our work, and understanding them means that we can be much more effective. And I know lots of people have lots of other things going on in their life, and it will mean that the amount of energy that you can put into MP Watch can be as effective as it possibly can be. When I say MPs throughout this, I'm kind of mean politicians more broadly within the UK. So we include, for example, Lord Cameron within that, and any other politicians who might not specifically be an MP. So yes, that's the purpose of this workshop. What we're going to cover, so first, I'm going to do some speedy introductions. I'm going to try not to spend too much time on introductions, if that's okay, as nice as it is having a check-in, just because I want to make sure that we get through. We've got quite a lot to get through in an hour and a half. We're then going to do what is an MP's job and what influences them. That's going to be me kind of presenting a few slides with some time for questions as we go. And that will probably take about half an hour. And then we're going to do a bit of a task, which is mapping your MP. So you're going to be in groups to do that, and you're going to start creating some influence maps for your specific MPs. We're then going to talk a little bit about what to do in the first meeting with your MP, and also parliamentary candidates for those of you in a constituency that's likely to change in the next election. And then we'll talk about next steps. So starting off, just thinking about what is an MP's job. Kind of astonishingly, there wasn't a job description for MPs until I think it was 2012. They just did what they'd always done for better or for worse. And then in I think it was in 2012, there was a speakers conference on MPs and representation in Parliament. And the main point of this conference was to kind of establish exactly what an MP's job is. And essentially, they decided that an MP's two main responsibilities are as a legislator, so debating, making and reviewing laws, deciding government policy, and also as an advocate for the people in their constituency. So those are the two, you can see the two that are in kind of peach at the top of those slides. And all MPs do those two things. Those are their core jobs. And as well as those two jobs, MPs can do a few other things. So that could be taking a role as a government minister, having a role in their political party, so being a spokesperson, coordinating campaigns, advising leaders, and having a role in Parliament. So that might be being on a bill committee or chairing a debate. And what those kind of extra additional roles that MPs might have obviously really impact their priorities and impact how you can influence them. So it's kind of important to know what further responsibilities any MP has if you want to influence them. And from this conference, and this was a conference that kind of all MPs decided, the headline was, a good MP will make a positive difference to the community he or she represents. I'm sure everyone's got thoughts on how well some MPs do that, but I think it's helpful to understand that that is what they are supposed to be doing. And so that is something that it's very valid to hold them to account for not doing, or to ask them to do better. Also, it's worth kind of thinking a little bit about these two responsibilities that are in peach at the top. Being an advocate for the constituency in a really local way, and also a legislator reviewing laws in a national sense, are sometimes in conflict with each other, or at least they can pull MPs' priorities in different directions. And often MPs, I think, find themselves spending more time on one than the other, or being pulled between the two. So it's also worth being aware that there's that kind of central conflict in an MP's job. And that's something that you can, again, hold them to account on if you feel like they're not, for example, advocating for people in their constituency enough. So who are the people in an MP's life? I'm going to talk through these one by one, and then I'm going to pause on this slide for a moment to just hear any questions about who the people in an MP's life might be. And this is just really helpful, I think, from like quite a practical way, like knowing knowing who you're talking to if you're contacting an MP's office, for example. If you read things in the news or on WhatsApp groups, knowing who those people are. So I'm going to start with the parliamentary office, and then I'll work round. So most MPs in their parliamentary office have someone looking at those three roles: a casework person, a policy person, and a press person. It's quite a good idea to get to know, I'm sure quite a few of you already do know, but get to know who the people in your MP's office are. MPs don't read their emails mainly, and they definitely don't read them as they come in. They might read emails that are kind of flagged to them by their office as emails they should read, but they won't be the first port of call for any of their emails. It will be members of their office who will have often kind of thousands, definitely hundreds of emails a day, and who will be sorting those emails into normally different inboxes for casework, for policy, and for press. So if there's something that you want to talk to your MP about and it specifically falls into one of those categories, it's really important to flag that in the email quite high up so that the office knows what to do with it. Casework tends to be, and again, I'm sure people will know this, but tends to be immediate constituency issues. So those could be, for example, if you're concerned about a sewage pipe leaking into a river and it needs fixing, that would go into casework. Policy is for the MP's role as a legislator, so broad and national debates. So if there's a bill going on to do with pollution in rivers and you want them to vote a certain way, so it'd be the kind of broader, more national policy version. And press is self-explanatory, anything, and it could be all of those things, obviously, but anything that is in the media, that's where they'll be contacted by news outlets. And you probably wouldn't need to be contacting the press person within the MP's office, but it's definitely worth finding out if they have one. Smaller MPs with kind of lesser responsibilities and a lesser budget for spending on their office will only have the first two. Not everyone will have a press officer. So then following the parliamentary office, we'll go to whips. I'm sure everyone's heard of whips and the whipping system. Whips are MPs or peers who are linked to a political party, and they're appointed to make sure that the colleagues in the party, they're MPs, but that their colleagues in the party vote according to the leader's agenda and what the leader wants. And there are currently 24 whips in government, 16 in the Commons, 8 in the Lords. That's for the Conservatives, for the government. And then Labour has 12 whips in the Commons and 14 in the Lords, and there's kind of a chief whip who controls all the whips, and their main role essentially is to act as a link between the front bench, so the government or the shadow cabinet, and the backbenchers, so it keeps all the backbenchers in line. That's where whipping, a kind of almost, I might imagine once there might have been some actual physical violence involved, and there definitely is still bullying and aggression, and if not actual whipping, kind of metaphorical whipping. Green Party doesn't have whips, they have musterers. I think they decided in the 90s that whipping was too violent. Good for them. If you have the whip removed as an MP, that's if you haven't voted in line with how the party is telling you to vote, so you've broken the whip. And once you've had the whip removed, that means you're no longer a member of your party, so you don't have the support that comes with being in a party. And you probably also heard of a 3-line whip. That means not only do MPs have to vote in a specific way, yes, for or against, it means they also have to vote, they have to turn up, unless they've got a really strong mitigating circumstance for not being there. So during Brexit, for example, during the Brexit votes, there were lots of 3-line whips. So then moving on to the party, I think that's probably more self-explanatory, but it's definitely worth understanding kind of what the party links mean to each MP in particular. It's not always the same. They might have different types of party loyalty depending on how old they are, for example, or what type of how they've come into the party. We'll go on to influences more in a second. Special advisors, known as SPADs, isn't SPADs written or spoken about, but special advisors are members appointed by the party often. So there's a few special advisors that advise the leadership of the party, and they're also appointed by ministers. So ministers in government will have their own special advisors. Special advisors are political, even when they're in the civil service. and can be really influential. I don't know if anyone saw the Laura Kuenssberg documentary State of Chaos, but I think from that, the role of Theresa May's advisors in the 2019 election was really clear, and kind of how they'd driven a specific manifesto agenda and actually were very influential within that. So special advisors can be very influential. Dominic Cummings being the obvious example. And then civil service office. So as well as the parliamentary office on the right-hand side, if an MP is made a minister, they will have a civil service office. And when they're not a minister, the parliamentary office is like the MP's home. They do everything for the MP. As soon as they become a minister, the parliamentary office takes a bit of a backseat role. They might get 1 day a week with their MP, but the MP will spend 4 days of the week in the government department, and the parliament and the civil service office will be the people dealing with most of their correspondence. So I was in Dominic Raab's office during the Brexit votes and during Brexit as a civil servant, so not as a non-political person. And during that time, his parliamentary office was not really in the picture because he was a minister in a senior government role. So that's worth being aware of if your MP is also a minister, knowing how much their parliamentary office will be able to contact them. The opposition, the other party, if they're one of the two major parties, voters, self-explanatory, and MP Watch. Does anyone have any questions about all those people in an MP's life and how they might work together? You can put questions in the chat as well if you want. No. We'll have lots of time for discussion later as well.
Sorry, Daisy, just a quick question. It's Charlotte. I didn't put my video on. So about whips, I mean, it just strikes me that if MPs are just going to vote along party lines, what is the point in us even talking to them?
Yes, I mean the whipping system is archaic. Lots of countries, definitely most European countries, don't have a whipping system, and I think a lot of people would agree. Like it does, it's really polarizing, and it really shuts down debate and does make it harder to influence MPs. I think it would be dishonest to say it wasn't. I think, like, firstly, the whips are set by the party, and you can still influence the party through MPs. So it just means that it's like maybe less of a direct influence in some ways. Like there's lots of conversations going on behind the scenes that set the party's agenda, and that sets how the whips are telling MPs to vote. So it means that maybe there's often less of a direct link to like how an MP votes because they're strung by the whip, but your MP or most MPs will be involved in all those party conversations in the coffee shops, in the bars, in the different rooms of Westminster and in meetings, and that sets the whip. So it makes it much less transparent. It's like very problematic as a system. It doesn't mean MPs don't have any influence. It just means that they're not necessarily able to always choose how they vote. MPs do break the whip, and I think that's something that we've seen more and more in the last 10 years for various reasons. So definitely being able to point to positive examples of MPs breaking the whip. And breaking the whip does not always mean you have the whip removed. That often doesn't. So MPs can vote against their party without being kicked out of their party. And I think that's something definitely an MP Watch we want to encourage.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And how often is there a vote? How often is the whip applied? So are there votes where MPs are allowed to vote with their conscience or as they think their constituents would want them to vote, which is what they should be doing, rather than following the whip? How often does it happen that they don't have to follow a whip?
Not that often. I mean, it does happen, but not that often. It often happens on like constitutional issues or issues where there would be even more conflicts of interest than there already are if MPs are being whipped. There's also votes that where MPs are like just not whipped very much. Sounds strange saying it, but like there's the whip. It's a sort of a minor bill or something that's like less political, and the whips just don't put much energy into it. So it's like slightly freer. And then there's the really high profile votes, which are 3-line whips. Yeah, so I can see Jess and I think Leslie, you also had your hand up.
Thank you.
Want to come in?
I think Leslie was first, or do you no longer want to go, Leslie?
Daisy said what I was going to say about breaking the whip.
Ah, okay. What about lobbyists? Simon Honey also put that in the chat.
Good question. Yeah, they should probably be on there. Thank you, Simon. Yes, lobbyists are definitely people in an MP's life, and can influence MPs in all sorts of ways, like positive and negative. And there's definitely good and more ethical lobbying, and then lobbying that might kind of use interests or kind of malign pressure, not always in very ethical ways. But yes, lobbying should be on there. Did you have something in particular, Simon, that you wanted to say about lobbying? It's a good point that it should be on there. I'll add it on for next time.
Can I ask another question, which maybe takes you a bit into kind of philosophical territory, so you might not want to go too far down the road, but it feels like a lot of what the government does these days is political rather than kind of getting to grips with departments and running the country. And would you, from your window into the process, associate the rise of the SPAD with that?
Yes, to an extent. I mean, SPADs are useful. They're not, and they're part of their role is, so the advice that a minister is getting from its civil service department has to be apolitical. And sometimes there needs to be a kind of political lens on that. So like Brexit was an obvious example. The advice that I was giving Dominic Raab through DexU was about the impacts on citizens' rights of this particular bill, for example. And it was neutral. And a minister of whatever party they're from will want that advice to be framed politically. So a SPAD would look at the advice that I was writing and would add in their own advice, saying things like, well, Labour's going to say blah, 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 or this is going to cause a rift in our party for these reasons. And they would add the political angle, which is important. I think the issue, as you alluded to, Jessica, is when it becomes overly political and you lose the factual advice underneath that. And that relationship, there's always an interesting relationship between civil servants and ministers and SPADs. It's kind of a triangle. And I think what we've seen sometimes in recent years is that triangle has become a bit uneven. I can see some good comments and questions in the chat about like broader influences. So I'm going to move on to the next slide if that's okay, because that's what I'm going to talk about next, and then I'll pick up those on the next slide. So influences on MPs. So if we've kind of looked broadly at who the actual kind of factual people in their lives are, in a practical way, we can also think about what some of the influences on MPs might be. So I'm going to quickly run through them, and then this is where I thought it would be helpful to kind of hear a few thoughts from people, and any questions and anything I've missed off, because as with lobbyists, there will be things on here that are missed off. So I'm going to start with thinking about money and interests. So obviously that's a huge influence on MPs, as it is on lots of people. Sometimes this can be used to kind of exert pressure on MPs, and MPs can use it, as we know, to kind of vote in ways which aren't always for the best of their constituency or for the general population. So this money and interest can come in the form of donations, so party donors, for example, and then party donors being able to exert pressure on the party and on the whip, and therefore on all the MPs within that party. It can come in the form of jobs, so MPs having second jobs, which is obviously controversial. They're in their investments. So if an MP has investment interests in a certain sector and then is voting to defend that sector, and commercial contracts, as we saw with COVID. So that's often kind of indirect. So through a network, an MP being able to give benefits to someone in their wider network through awarding commercial contracts. That's normally a minister. Like an MP doesn't really have power to award contracts, but a minister would through a government department. I think, yeah, that like all of that should be declared, and a lot of an MP having money through different routes is like not necessarily a bad thing if it's declared. MPs have often been people in life before they were MPs, and they will be after they are MPs, and everyone has interests. I think it's often about how these are declared, how significant they are, and how kind of ethically those are affecting the issues that the MP is voting on. Then and kind of comes, just as if everything comes down to how honest they are about those interests. Career advancement, that's a huge factor, especially for MPs really early in their career. I think we're going to see this a lot after the election with people who are coming in from being candidates at the moment, is really thinking about how they want to position for their career. That's often the reason, for example, that an MP would go on a bill committee, potentially the only reason an MP would go on a bill committee, because they're famously low impact but good for your career. The pressure from the media, I think that's self-explanatory, but that can be national media and also local media from a constituency point of view. Personal values, most MPs go into politics because a lot of MPs go into politics because they care about something personally, and that's really important to understand, I think, especially if you're engaging with an MP in a really constructive ways, to understand what their values are and what's driven them to do their job. Manifesto promises. Some of these influences change over time. I think manifesto promises is a good example of that. So the government is bound by the promises it made in its last manifesto. And as we get closer to an election, those promises will become more and more important because they are a stick for the opposition to beat them with. So in government, in the civil service, you start getting kind of emails round all the departments saying, write up, prove how this department has met its manifesto promises in the last 3 or 4 years, and you've got to kind of pull together evidence on how you've met your manifesto promises. And then those all go into number 10, into the SPADs, to kind of be able to set out exactly how the manifesto promises has been met. So that can be a good way to kind of influence and talk to your MP, especially in the period before an election, is thinking about what manifesto promises have their party made and not delivered on. Networks and alliances, so yes, who they're sitting next to, literally, and who they're loyal to. You can often find that information out through kind of backdated media, for example, and projects they've done, and loyalty to constituency. So as we saw from the MP's job description, they do all need to defend the interests of their constituency, and a lot of them will have constituency loyalties. So that can be a good way to speak and influence them. I'm going to pause on this slide and ask if anyone's got any questions or thoughts or anything they think I've missed. Leslie, I know you've got to go. That's it. Yeah, I can see Charlotte said clubs that Tories in particular, being members of specific clubs that fund them normally through lobbyists to vote in a certain way. That could be through lobbyists or through industry. Jess.
How do MPs and ministers justify donations, to them as MPs, because or as politicians, because it seems just like Priti Patel took 100K from a oil trader with lots of dodgy Russian influences at the time when she was in charge of who was sort of permissible and who wasn't. I've forgotten what that job's called, yeah, so I just don't understand. From the outside it just seems woeful, but from the inside presumably people justify it, and I just wondered how they did that.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be for a reason. You can't accept a gift as an MP or as a minister, but that's undeclared, and that you can't claim why you've done it. Like, this is all, and everything I'm saying, and I hope it's obvious, is is the theory, and this system is obviously exploited and is always exploited in different ways. So in terms of the rules, you can't accept a gift above a certain amount without declaring it, and also without saying kind of why that gift was and what it was for. It does happen in practice. yeah, I can only really agree with you, Jess. It's the issue. There's some comments in the chat about, yeah, so like ERG, the European Research Group, is a good example of kind of lobbying and think tanks, which the ERG was like specific members of the Tory party in the run up to Brexit, and was also funded by major donors with different interests and think tanks. So it was like a specifically influential group at the time that was also putting out its own research and policy. And I think that's, maybe that kind of links with lobbying is where, and we see it obviously a lot with the climate crisis, is where specific groups with interests are both funding and putting out research, and that's particularly potent mix. Example. Any more thoughts? There's lots of useful comments in the chat. Simon has a question. How do you interpret donations if you have no details? Do you mean, Simon, if it's impossible to see who it's from, if it's just like a front or a...
How do I... Can never... Right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I'm never quite sure if the microphone's on or off. Something on the MP Watch thing. I followed a link, and it was to the declarations for my local MP, Paul Scully. And I don't know, it's just like a company name. So unless I go off to company's house for every company's name to find out what they do, and it might not describe it there anyway, how do I decide if they're iffy, okay, or benign?
Yeah, it's really hard to do as an individual.
Right.
Like you could, and this is, investigative journalists would do this for their entire job, and it's still like it's quite an oblique system. So I think I don't really have an answer unless anyone's got like a magic way of finding out where, like what name a company might be hiding behind. I know, and I think we're going to speak about it in a bit, but it might be a good moment, Jessica, to mention the MP Watch funding tracker.
Yes, so some of you will know because I've been bragging and talking about it, and it's been kind of a long time coming. But those of you who have checked out the website will see that there's a sort of I've forgotten exactly what he's called it, but a kind of donation tracker. And Simon's right, it can be quite hard to follow the online documents through Hansard or other government kind of spreadsheets, which will give you a particular period and what those donations are. And you have to click on lots of different documents, and it may just be a name of a company or so what we've got is a tech wonder person who does things that I can only dream about, who is gathering a lot of the information from those spreadsheets and just putting them in one place. There still will be some research that we'll need doing on it. And so, for example, my MP, Sally Ann Hart, I saw that when she had first become an MP, she got a 10k donation from Lord somebody or the other. When I looked him up, I found that he had a construction company, and not just that, but that construction company had been active in Hastings at about the time that Sally Ann Hart became an MP. And they had done some work for the government on the local job centre and on something else. So that's really useful information, and it means that when you meet your MP, or maybe when you're at Hastings, it would be possible to say, would you mind explaining, it's good if you can trap them courteously. Would you mind explaining why, at the same time as this building was going on, Lord so-and-so gave you 10,000? How did that work? Quite often, actually, with sorry, I won't go on too much, but when we've done work on the Global Warming Policy Foundation, they will give MPs very small amounts of money, 3K, 5K. So the oil companies are not, the Priti Patel was a little bit of an exception, but they're not flagrantly throwing money at MPs. They may be doing it to the party, but they're not doing it usually to individual MPs. Anyway, so watch this space. We'll be making a big noise in the national group when the donation tracker comes onto the website, and you'll all be able to have a look at what your MPs received while they've been in office.
Thanks, Jessica. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So this is always Stuart, obviously. I thought it was just worth pausing for a moment and thinking about some of the, we've looked at kind of some of the influences, lots of which end up being malign, but also some of the challenges that MPs face. I've seen quite a lot of books and interviews by MPs in the last few years, and resignations from MPs about some of the challenges MPs face in doing their job. Most MPs, or a lot of MPs, find when they do start in Parliament that they don't spend much time legislating, or are shocked at like how short amount of time there is in actually scrutinising legislation, which is, after all, kind of half of their job. And also how hard it is to, and I don't want to excuse any behaviour in any way, but how hard it is to have an impact without being drawn into some of the kind of backroom dealings, which is where a lot of the discussion and a lot of the power happens. And so you could go into those spaces and really want to make change for positive and do things that we all think are really important, I'm sure. But at the same time, you're in this world and in this system where power does work in kind of slightly dark and shady places. And at the same time, new MPs find Westminster very confusing. Apparently it takes 7 years to be able to kind of vaguely find your way around the system. There's a huge amount of strange rules and channels for power and committees, and like the physical building as well is just famously very confusing, has all sorts of strange things in it. So I think that is worth bearing in mind, especially after the election when we have new MPs, is how to kind of make sure that we are aware and able to kind of use that knowledge to our benefit when we're speaking to MPs. I thought I'd just play this clip. It might not work. Or it might make me play an advert.
Rory Stewart's book is full of poetry.
Can you see that video? Or is it still showing the slides? You can see the video.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. I'm going to go to.
I was being serious for a moment. I think I found going into Parliament very, very depressing. I think it's much worse than I imagined. And I think it's a strange thing to say because obviously the public has a pretty negative impression of politicians, but I think worse than most of the public would imagine in the way that it operates. It's the parties, the whips, the campaigning, the way that Parliament works. It's not a sensible way of doing anything. There was very little serious conversation about policy, that we were very badly equipped for the way the world was changing. It created very odd personalities. I felt this myself. I felt I was becoming a much worse person the longer I was in politics. I was getting stupider, I was getting less good. And so I'm trying to explain the problem. And I think basically I've come to the conclusion, the basic problem is that you shouldn't run everything from the centre. Yes, it's a particularly sick centre, doing particularly bad things, but even if you reformed it, the fundamental problem is that we need to give power away. We need to decentralise.
Do you think now, with the benefit of hindsight, that you're actually suited to politics? You've done a lot of other things, as well as the 6 ministerial positions, as well as being a Conservative MP. You were an army officer. You worked for the intelligence service. Were you possibly at one time to Britain what this parliamentary researcher might be to China, a charge he's vehemently denied? Are you actually not the right person to be in politics?
I suspect all of us in our jobs feel a bit at odds with our jobs. And there were some things that I failed at spectacularly. I clearly failed to prevent Boris Johnson from becoming Prime Minister. I failed to stop his particular version of a hard Brexit. I failed to stop the lurch of the Conservative Party to the populist right. These were very, very deep failures that I felt really guilty about. And I feel that they really mattered because I put 9 years of my life into trying to make sense of this whole thing. And I finished at a time when British politics was its most shambolic and shameful. Other things I'm reasonably good at. I mean, I think we don't hold politicians to the same standard that we hold other people to. And I guess if I would say to you, are you completely suited to be a Times journalist? Your answer would probably be yes. Some bits I am, some bits I'm not, some bits I'm good at, some bits I'm not. One of the things I'm trying to do is help people understand that politics is a job, and a very messy job with a lot of the same frustrations that every job has. Crazy bosses, mounds of paperwork, bureaucracy, nonsense, doing a lot of things that don't feel very useful.
It's a really claustrophobic.
Okay, I'm going to stop there, but I'll share these slides afterwards, obviously, and the link is in there if anyone wants to watch the full interview. But I think it is quite, it's helpful to see, especially from like a Tory, definitely centre-right politician, like reflecting on some of those things, and that's something that's echoed in what a lot of MPs say. I've just read Why We Get the Wrong Politicians, and a lot of in that book as well is kind of interviewing different MPs, talking about how they felt like Westminster changed them, and that's not an excuse, but I think it is interesting to kind of reflect on the system that they're operating within, as well. Obviously, there are also bad actors within that system, but they're not all bad actors. So we're going to do a task in a moment, but I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the information sources. I've spoken a lot about influences, but it can be hard to find these things out. So here are just a few information sources that I think is helpful. A lot of this is probably repetitive and you probably already know it, so I won't spend too long. So I'm going to start in the top left with They Work For You. I'm sure people have heard of They Work For You. It's a great website run by My Society, which is a like not-for-profit. My Society did have a lot of good resources in this space in general, including local climate action plans, which I don't know if people are aware of, but you can kind of see the action plan for climate for your council and your constituency. That's a tangent. Like in Parliament, like parliamentary researchers in MPs' offices use They Work For You. They don't use the Parliament website, which is kind of crazy because they are Parliament, but They Work For You, even though it's run by charities, become so good that it's kind of replaced the Parliament website within Parliament. That said, there's Hansard down here on the bottom left, which is useful for looking for parliamentary record, keyword searches. It's actually like not that hard to use. I feel like Hansard has a bit of a bad reputation. Once you get used to it, and if you're searching for something quite specific, it is quite helpful for reading a speech, that you can kind of pull out quotes, things that your MP has said. Sites like Vote Climate is just one example. They have kind of lists of MPs' voting records on climate, and have ranked MPs by kind of the best votes on climate to worst votes on climate. Also, the MP Watch incubated platform that Jess has spoken about would be in that bucket of like very helpful places that consolidate information that's hard to find out otherwise. And then Election Maps UK, there's loads of different polling and like kind of infographic sites. I like Election Maps UK because I like how it doesn't show constituencies, it shows those hexes you can see in the picture there, actually representative of how many MPs there are in Parliament. Sometimes when you look at different election maps, they like crunch London into, you can't really see what's going on, and then the colours aren't actually representative because they show some constituencies are obviously huge with a low population density. So Election Maps UK is a good place to go. They also have really good information on boundaries, so I go just look at boundary changes. News, obviously local and national. It's important to look at both. I put a pub there. It does not mean you need to go to the pub, but kind of local spaces. I think like it's easy sometimes to discount conversations in person on the street as valid information sources. But yeah, one of the best ways to find things out. And then social media. I put Twitter, and then I've also put Facebook and Instagram, which can seem unlikely because I think most people think of going to Twitter, but like most MPs' Twitter accounts are very curated. They will be run by someone in their office. They won't necessarily, they will reflect that MP's views, but it might, not all MPs curate them very carefully, obviously. But sometimes looking at Facebook and Instagram is quite interesting to see. Like your MP might have like an open account with their personal life, not that you want to kind of stalk them, but it's helpful to see. Sometimes it can be like slightly less guarded, and interesting to kind of understand their personal values. And then I put MP Watch, obviously a great source of information, and also like alongside the MP Watch WhatsApp groups, for example, other WhatsApp groups. It's good to kind of have a system for. Sometimes it can feel like a lot of information, but kind of maybe time to like check WhatsApp groups and take any useful information off them and then leave them for a few days and then check them again, or kind of develop your own personal system for kind of choosing what groups are helpful to be part of and use the information from them. We're going to get on to the activity next because I'm aware that I've been talking for ages, but does anyone have any other places they go for information that's helpful to share? Or any questions about any of these places? Jess.
Well, I'm always on the government website, actually. Whenever there's a new MP, you can see the result of the last election, and you can also see how if it were a Conservative MP, you can see how the Lib Dems and the Labour, if they balance each other out, or if one is dominant or the other, and that's really like the bricks and mortar of what we're doing. I also like electoral calculus, but it's crude, but it takes the general swing of the latest poll, applies it to the country, and you can see how that would affect your constituency. But it does the whatever it's called, wobbles around. What do I mean? Wobbles around.
Dial thing?
Yes.
I know what you mean. And Private Eye, I can see in the chat, yes. Private Eye is a great source of kind of gossip and information, all the background stuff.